welcome everyone. This is the Distinguished Lecture Series for the Department of Computer Science. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. He's coming from UC Berkeley. Michael Jordan, he's a professor with a joint appointment both in computer science and statistics. He graduated in 1988, I believe, from UCSD in San Diego. He spent 10 years at MIT, and he joined the faculty at Berkeley in 1998. He has a very diverse, wide range of interests in applying statistics to a large number of other domains, such as bioinformatics, computer networking, and artificial intelligence. And without further ado, I'll give the stage to Mike.
All right, thank you. It's 7 o'clock on the West Coast, so I will wake up probably halfway through the talk. Anyway, I'm glad to be here. It's a pleasure. See a few people who I recognize. Let me start by saying something about what all these words in the title are. What is machine learning? What is non-parametric? What's Bayesian? I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. I don't know if there's any way to help that. So let me first of all say what machine learning is. Machine learning is really not a new field. It's in my view, a part of statistics. So let me say a little bit more about what computer science and statistics are. That's humorous? I thought that was obvious. Computer science and statistics really are not that distinct. They're both about data in some broad sense of the term, and many of the originators of these two fields were the same people. So they were unified, and they've kind of split apart as time went on, partly because the problems were just so hard that they needed separate attention. But as time has gone on, they've become to merge again. And so, you see certainly in things like sensor networks and so on, great amounts of stochasticity, and computer scientists are having to face that now. And statisticians are obviously working with algorithms much more in computer science issues are arising. So let's look at what these two fields have done well over the years, and what by complement the other two fields that's not done as well. So computer science has really done well with data structures and algorithms, things like the trees and graphs and so on. You see less of that in statistics. What statistics has done well is the main problem of inference, of management, certainty, and justifying decisions. And computer science has had accordingly much less focus on that. So these two issues are complementary. They should be brought together. And machine learning is really just an activity. It's not really a field that helps to make this merger happen. I think in 50 years, these two fields will really be pretty much merged. So it's not a new field. It's really just a collection of topics in statistics. The underlying problem is that of inference, giving me some partial description, fill in the rest of the description of the world, and then make decisions on that basis. And it's an old topic. It goes back several hundred years, and sort of at least 100 years of great deal of activity. And two perspectives have emerged. It's sort of like wave-particle duality. There really are two perspectives, and they're complementary in some ways, and they fight in other ways, but they both are valid perspectives on the thinking about the problem of inference. And if you're outside of statistics, it'll seem mysterious to these two points of view, but if you're inside, it's very fundamental to the field, and I think everyone will eventually start to understand these perspectives. And so if you're a computer scientist, maybe one way to think about it is this last bullet, is that Bayesians are optimists. They think that you can make a model of everything out in the world. If you make a good model, then they know what the right thing to do is. And frequentists are pessimists. They don't believe you can ever make a good model, and so they want to always protect themselves against the bad model that they're using. So these are the kind of the AI versus theory distinction in some sense. Now, in the learning on machine literature, there are Bayesian machine learning people, and there are frequentist machine learning people, just like there are in the rest of inferential fields. Now, it just happens that Bayesians have worked almost exclusively with parametric models whose dimensionality doesn't grow if you get more and more data. And on the other hand, the frequentists have worked mostly with non-parametric models. What that means is that the dimensionality grows as you see more and more data. That just happens to have been historically the focus. And so people have gotten these two things confused. They think Bayesian means parametric and frequentist is non-parametric. And so today we're going to be non-parametric Bayesians and show that these two things are not in a discord. And the point of this is in the third bullet is that we really want to bring the good side of computer science into statistics. We want to have flexible data structures and allow these data structures to grow as you get more and more data. That's kind of what's fundamentally missing in a lot of statistical inference. And it's not really messy because the framework of non-parametric Bayes is exactly the right framework to permit that. Okay, so I'm going to give you examples of this throughout the talk, but just as a mathematical issue, what this really means is not that strange, is that we have prior probabilities which are general stochastic processes. They aren't just finite dimensional random vectors. Okay, so just Bayesian inference 101. The Bayes theorem is the heart of Bayesian inference. So a posterior distribution is a likelihood times a prior. And in an elementary class, you'll write a formula like you see on the next line there, which is that a parameter vector is posterior, is proportional to the likelihood, which is the first term p of x given theta, where theta is the parameter and x is data, and multiplied by the prior p of theta. So if theta is a Euclidean parameter, this is kind of classical Bayesian analysis. It might have a Gaussian or a Dirichlet distribution or whatever. But in this talk, we're going to be writing theta. Instead of theta, we'll be writing g off it. And we mean this to be a general stochastic process. So what is the stochastic process? It's a usually infinite collection of random variables. So a whole path, it might be a draw from the stochastic process, or a tree, or an infinite set of clusters, or some other object which inherently has infinite dimensionality. And those objects are not all exotic in computer and statistics and probability. Those are called stochastic processes. So let me give you a few examples of where this line of work has kind of led to in terms of applications, and then I'll try to explain how these arose during the talk. So here's an example of an output of a system that we built based on non-parametric Bayesian methods, where the stochastic process was branch over trees. So the depth was arbitrary and infinite, and the branching factor was arbitrary and infinite. We have a probability distribution on trees like that. Okay, so it's a stochastic process whose instances are trees. And in every node in the tree, we have a distribution over a vocabulary, where the vocabulary is also open-ended. Okay, so there's some list of probabilities of words where that's an open-ended list. So we have a joint distribution over all these kind of objects. Now give me some data, and I'll give you a posterior distribution over trees and words. So the data in this case were the abstracts from the Journal of the ACM over the last 10 years. So that was pumped in as data. That was the X. And then the G was this distribution on trees and words and so on. And the posterior distribution this is the mode of it right here. This is the highest probability tree with some of the high probability words on that tree. And you can see that what happened is that the so-called function words percolated up to the top of the tree. So in this model, you generate a document by taking a random path down the tree. And so since all documents use the root, words that are useful in all documents will tend to percolate up to the top. So you see the function words going up there. And the next level you see, let's see, n, algorithm time. I guess n is the big O of n, right? So those are theory papers. Queries, classes, complexity. It's like complexity theory that programs language rules, networks, network routing, and so on. So it looks like a pretty good syllabus for a computer science department. And the next level down, it sort of specializes that, and this tree continues to go on down. So we did that with no free parameters. We gave in data, that's our stochastic process, and that's its posterior distribution. If you put in different data, and we did this with the Psychological Review, for example, and several other journals, you get out a different kind of tree that's specialized to that domain. Okay, so that is an example of something that this is not a parametric Bayesian analysis, this is a non-parametric Bayesian analysis because it's open-ended and adapts to the domain, grows as you give me more and more data. So here's a very different example that we've also worked on recently. We're modeling the backbone of a protein and trying to give a better energy function to the people who do protein folding. So a protein is a folded chain of amino acids, and the backbone has 2 degrees of freedom per amino acid. Okay, so you're walking along the backbone of a protein. There are 2 dihedral angles which specify each amino acid relative to the previous amino acid. So if you plot these 2 dihedral angles, phi and psi, those are called Ramachandran diagrams. You see a scatter plot like that. This is for alanine, a particular amino acid. And we would like to model that. We'd like to give you a density of that. That's for one some set of proteins. We'd like to give you a density so that you can then fold proteins under that density. Right, but the problem is even more interesting in that this is really a composite of many different Ramachandran diagrams. So for each left neighbor of amino acid and each right neighbor, if you really want to, the angles you get will be different. You've got steric clashes among the amino acids that'll sort of shift the distributions a bit. So you really have 400 different Ramachandran plots superimposed on that thing. 20 left neighbors, 20 right neighbors. There are 400 plots superimposed there. So we actually have a linked set of density estimation problems where we don't know the number of components of the density. It's very non-parametric looking. There's not a classical form there. And there's not just one such problem. There's 400 of them. They have to be linked in some way. Okay, so that's a very good example of a non-parametric estimation problem that we have been solving with the tools I'm going to describe today. Here's another problem, which is statistical natural language parsing. So we would like to take a labeled database in which we have a sentence and we have an actual derivation, parse tree. And the way this has been solved in recent years is to lexicalize a context-free grammar. What does that mean? It means that if you take a rule like sentence goes to noun phrase, verb phrase, you don't just have one such rule, you have many such rules, one in principle for every lexical item that you eventually generate in a parse tree. So it's a huge number of rules, and people who build these kind of grammars don't use all those rules. They cluster the rules in some typically ad hoc way to get a subset, a smaller subset of rules, which still does a pretty good job of handling all the exceptions that you get in real natural language. So that's called lexicalized grammars. And that is the state of the art. These methods work really quite well. And you get good natural language parsers out of these. So we're going to be able to solve this problem too. We're with stochastic processes on derivations now, on stochastic context-free grammars. And the methodology will allow us to capture the fact that we don't know how many clusters there are a priori, and to relate clusters, so that if a rule occurs in one part of a parse tree, the same rule occurs in another part of the parse tree, our method will be able to take that into account and relate those things. I think the problem is when I get close to this. So here's another problem, which has this flavor of, I don't know how many entities there are in the problem, and the number of entities should grow as I get more and more data. So that's kind of the theme that we're talking about here. So this is a population genetics problem, which is that I've got M binary markers in a genomic region, usually called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And so if I have M of them and they're binary, there are 2 to the M possible patterns that a human could exhibit in that region. That's called a haplotype. Okay? But if you actually look at a real human population, you see far fewer than 2 to the M, way far fewer. So probably what happens, there's a bottleneck back in the past, and those founders led, their chromosomes have been what we're passing back and forth from henceforth. So that's what a haplotype is. It's a pattern on a single chromosome. But chromosomes come in pairs, and what you assay biologically is not a haplotype or a pair of haplotypes. You get what's called a genotype, which is the unordered set of markers. So this is chromosome 1, this is chromosome 2, and so I have allele A, big A here, and allele big A on the other chromosome, and so on. And when you assay this at reasonable cost, you get out the unordered set that you learn there's a big A and a little a somewhere, but you don't know which one which chromosome. Right? And so going backwards from that kind of data, which is what you really get, this is really one of the more important problems in population genetics these days, called the haplotype phasing problem. Okay, so this turns out to be a clustering problem. It's really a mixture, a finite mixture model. And the main problem with it is that you don't know how many clusters there are. So you don't know how many haplotypes there are out there in the population. The whole problem is really trying to figure out what those haplotypes are. But moreover, it's really interesting these days to take into account things like ethnic group or geographical covariance and so on, where I don't just have one group of population data, I've got several groups. Here's the Asians, here's the Europeans, here's the Africans, and I want to find the haplotypes in each group. If I were just to merge all the data, I might wash out the small number of data points I got for, let's say, the Asians. So I want to keep them separate, but on the other hand, everybody came originally out of Africa. We all have somewhat of the same haplotypes, and so you want to actually have you want to have shared groups of clusterings as well. Okay, so I hope you get a little flavor of kind of the problems that you attack in non-parametric Bayesian inference. You have unknowns of structural unknowns, like the number of things, and but there are lots of connections among things that you want to try to preserve. Okay, so let me give you one more example. So this has been an open problem for a while as to how to build a hidden Markov model, which is, I hope you already know what that is. It's a doubly stochastic Markov chain where you observe x1 through xt. Shading means you observe the value, and the other nodes are unobserved. And you'd like to be able to do this where you don't know the cardinality of the state space. Okay, so the z's have some cardinality, and the arrows going from left to right are transition probabilities among the states. And in many problems, it's really not the case that you know the number of states. Okay, so it's a model selection problem. And that's the same kind of problem we're talking about here. We don't know the numbers of things, and somehow these things also have to be related among themselves. So I'm going to talk about one methodology called the Dirichlet process, which allows you to talk about open-ended numbers of clusters, and then another one called the hierarchical Dirichlet process, which allows you to tie them and kind of start to work towards a rich language for structural features in a non-parametric Bayesian setting. Then I'll talk about another stochastic process called the beta process and hierarchies of those things, which give you another kind of ingredient which you can build models. And there are lots of others. This is the ones I've chosen for the talk. We worked with other things like gamma processes and other sorts of things, and I may allude to them by the end of the talk. Okay, so let's jump in with a very concrete problem. That was kind of some motivation to give you an idea what a stochastic process is that's useful for this kind of statistics, and then try to generalize it. So let's just think about the problem of clustering, which is one of the classic problems in all of statistics, and one of the big problems is how to choose a number of clusters. And so I've just kind of given some list of some of the ways that people have done this. It's a very incomplete list. But let me not get into those. Let me talk about a different approach, something called the Chinese restaurant process, which is a non-parametric Bayesian methodology. So this process is just a little simple stochastic process on partitions. So I'm in people, and I'm going to partition them into subsets. And the partitions will be random. So I have a stochastic process on partitions. So how does that work? Well, the first person comes in and sits at the first table. This is a Chinese restaurant with an infinite number of tables, and this person sits there deterministically. The second person comes in and joins that person with probability a half, say that here, or they start a new table with probability a half. And the general rule is that you join a table proportional to the number of people already at the table. Okay, so it's a kind of preferential attachment kind of dynamics. And after n people have come in, we've got a partition of those people, random partition, and there are order log n occupied tables. Okay? It's a random quantity, but the mean is log n. And this has some other mathematical properties that we'll be getting to pretty soon that are pretty important. It's not just an arbitrary way to partition people. Now, if we want to build a clustering methodology around this stochastic process, we're going to be Bayesian in this talk. So the way we do that is that the first time someone sits at a table, say this person sits there, they draw a parameter vector for some distribution from some distribution on parameters. So this might be, suppose we're doing Gaussian mixture clustering, where a cluster has a mean and a covariance matrix. It's a Gaussian, and we have several of those. All right, so each one of the clusters is a table, and the table has got a mean and a covariance matrix. That's what phi would be. It would be the whole list of the mean and the covariance for that cluster. And then everybody else who sits at this table inherits the same mean and covariance matrix, so they belong to that cluster. All right? So now we have a distribution on everything we care about, how to partition up the data points, and then how to model each cluster from a Bayesian point of view. So that's now we have the P of G. That's the G is the tables. That's the Chinese restaurant process. We have a P of X given G. That's the data given the tables. That would include the parameters and then the distribution of the data given the parameters. And so now we can turn the crank of Bayesian inference and go backwards. We can say, given some data, find me a probability distribution on Chinese restaurants. Here I just generated some data in the forward direction, where phi was indeed a mean covariance matrix taken from some distribution. And then the data was taken as Gaussian with that as the parameter. And so you can start to see as I generate a few data, I have a few clusters, and more clusters get generated as I start to arise as I start to generate more and more data. And so the statistical inference problem, that's kind of forward direction. The statistical inference problem is going backwards, which says that giving just the blue dots, recover those ellipsoids. Right? One ellipsoid for every table of my Chinese restaurant, so it'll recover the Chinese restaurant underlying statement. Okay, and let me just give one slide on computational methodology for doing this. There's a huge literature on it. We've contributed to this, but that's not what the talk is. This is really more about modeling. But let me just give you a flavor of how it works. How do you go backwards? So the simplest algorithm I can describe is an example of a Gibbs sampler, a very simple stochastic sampler. And it is based on an important fact, which is the Chinese restaurant process is exchangeable. What does that mean? It means that I've got a distribution on partitions, and it seems like it was dependent on the ordering in which people arrived, because I had a first person, then a second person, and so on. But it turns out the actual resulting distribution on partitions is independent of ordering. Okay, that means it's exchangeable. Okay? And there's a theorem I'll give you in a couple of slides, which says that if it's exchangeable, there's an underlying representation in terms of an underlying stochastic process. But for now, we can use the exchangeability idea as a computational fact, which is that in Gibbs sampling, what I do is I take every one of my random variables that I'm trying to assign a value to, and I isolate it. Think about it, pull it out of the system and look at, freeze all the other variables, and then conditional on all the other variables, figure out what that value of that random variable should be. So particularly here, I take one customer, I take that customer out of the system, I freeze all the other customers, and I say, now what table should that customer sit at given everybody else's sitting pattern? Right? And then in general, that would be a hard computation to do. It would, if I had a non-exchangeable distribution. But if I have exchangeable distribution, it's easy, because what I can do is take that person out and then pretend they're the last person to arrive. Because I can scramble the people and I get the same distribution. So I pretend they're the last person to arrive. And if they're the last person to arrive, everybody else has already sat down. They just join a table proportional to the number of people at that table. That's a very simple rule. Right? That's the prior. And then the likelihood is that whatever distribution at that table, if they look like they're generated by that distribution, they should sit at that table. So I have prior and likelihood, and now I can just sit the person now at that point, and that's Gibbs sampler. Okay, so this is not state-of-the-art. This is not a good algorithm for the problem, but it gives you on one slide an idea. And throughout the rest of the talk, I'm not going to talk about inferential methods, but you can sort of just imagine things like a Gibbs sampler whenever I write down a model, because all of our methods are going to be exchangeable up until the very last slide. So what is exchangeability? Let me say a little bit more about it. So as a prior in the partition of the data, the CRP is exchangeable. Okay? Meaning that it's invariant to order of the data. Now, there's another way to think about this is that don't think about the partition structure, but think about the parameters assigned to each data point. If I sit at table 1, I get that parameter, so that's my parameter, and if I sit at table 2, I get a different parameter. So the probability distribution on the parameters assigned to data points is obviously also exchangeable because it's tied to the tables. Okay, so I can write that one out actually mathematically in a very simple way, which is this is the probability, the parameter for the ith data point, conditional on the parameters assigned to the previous I-1 data points. Well, that conditional is, by this Chinese restaurant dynamics, very simple. It's either you sit down at one of the previous tables and you inherit the parameter at that table. So that's its delta functions, one for each table. Or with some probability, alpha naught, I choose a brand new parameter, and that means I sit down at a new table. And at that point, G naught is the source of atoms for this process, the source of new parameters. So I draw from G naught. So that is the conditional distribution. And if I then multiply these out by the chain rule probability, I'll get the joint probability on all the thetas. And if you just multiply these guys out and swap sums and products, you'll see that you get a result which is independent of ordering. So that's your exchangeability proof. Okay. Now, if you have exchangeability, there's a very important theorem due to Di Finetti, sort of in some sense the fundamental theorem of Bayesian analysis, which says that the probability distribution on infinite collection of random variables is exchangeable if and only if the joint probability on any finite subcollection can be written in the following way. That it is a product of conditionals of each one of the data points, conditional on some underlying object, G, and that underlying object is a probability distribution on that you integrate out. Okay, so this is obviously symmetric in all the x's, so in one direction this theorem is trivial, but if you have this kind of representation, then these things are clearly exchangeable. You can permute them and get the same distribution. The deep fact is the other direction. If it's exchangeable, there must exist a G and a distribution on G that when you integrate out G, you get back to this symmetric distribution. Okay, so once you have an exchangeable distribution, there's always this interesting problem which arises, which what's the underlying G, right? So in particular, this Polya-Ern was discussed in probability literature for quite a long time, going back to probably back to the 40s, but it wasn't known for quite a long time what G was. What's the underlying G that gives you the Polya-Ern model or the Chinese restaurant process? Okay, so to describe that without doing any mathematics, let me use the graphical model notation. So just very briefly, a graph can represent a family of probability distributions in the following way. That the joint distribution, you associate each node in the graph a random variable, and the joint distribution on those random variables factorizes according to the graph, such that you just chain together the probability of a node given its parent. So for example, x4 has got a parent x2 in the graph, so we have a conditional of x4 given x2, and then we have some parameters to describe the distribution. We take the product of all those and that defines the joint. So
that's when I write a graph out, you should think about chaining together all of the conditional probabilities associated with edges of the graph. And then another piece of notation which will be useful is that this thing on the right-hand side, which is there's a set of variables that have an underlying theta that renders them conditionally dependent, we write in this way, that I have a box around something that's replicated, and the number of times I replicate it is given in the corner of the box. Okay, so with that notation, I can introduce one kind of model that we'll be working with, which is a finite mixture model. So I can either take the left column or the right column, whichever one you prefer, if you like the math or the picture. This is a way of generating clusterings where I already know the number of clusters. That's why it's called a finite mixture model. Okay, so let's do the math part first. So I'm going to build up this quantity G, which is going to be a sum of a finite number of atoms. So the delta function are atoms at locations phi. And phi comes from some underlying G naught, a source of the atoms. Okay? And then the pi's are the weights I associate to those atoms. And those come from some distribution, something called a Dirichlet distribution. And it has a parameter alpha naught. Okay, and now having gotten G, maybe I can go over to this diagram over here. So G has atoms at certain locations. That's these little kind of picket fence kind of things, the locations on the x-axis, and the heights are the pi values. All right, and the heights came from alpha naught, and the locations came from G naught. All right, so G is now a random object. It's a random measure, actually. It assigns measure to locations along the x-axis. And now a finite mixture model repeatedly samples from G, takes one of those locations with probability given by the heights, and that's what this symbol says. And then having gotten theta, it takes some probability distribution who has theta as its parameter and samples the x. So I might have a Gaussian with theta as a mean, and then x comes from that distribution. So I have three possible locations. I would have three Gaussians here, and I'm sampling from those three Gaussians proportional to the heights of those sticks. So that's a description of finite mixture model from a Bayesian point of view, because now the pi's and the thetas are random, which they wouldn't be in a frequentist setup. Okay, but we want to now be non-parametric. That's a parametric story. We have a fixed number of clusterings. We want the number of clusterings to be open-ended. So how can we do that? All right, so this is probably the more technical slide of the talk, but if you don't get it, the details aren't that important here. I just want to give you a flavor that you can get a distribution on an infinite number of integers that has a lot of nice mathematical properties. And the specific distribution is called a stick-breaking distribution. And the way it works is that you take a sequence of beta random variables. So beta has a parameter, two parameters, 1 comma alpha naught. It's the same alpha naught as before. And there's an infinite number of these things. So the beta distribution lives on the interval from 0 to 1. And this particular beta kind of looks like this. It has a lot of small values and then fewer values, and it lives on 0, 1. So if I sample for a beta, I get a number between 0 and 1. So let's define the first pi value. We get an infinite number of these. But the first one is going to be just beta 1. So it's some number between 0 and 1. So this is laid out from 0 to 1. All right. Then take the remainder of the stick. This is a stick. That's 1 minus beta. And then take a fraction of that, where beta 2 is another beta random variable. That's this amount. And call that pi 2. And then so on. This is pi 3 and pi 4 and so on. Okay, so I get these are random numbers now that add to 1. They're an infinite collection of them. And they have some nice mathematical properties. Okay, this is called the GEM, or stick-breaking distribution. Okay, so given that, so there's my general definition of the pi's, I can now form an infinite sum of atoms at certain locations where phi, again, is coming from some distribution G naught. And pi's are the height, but now there's an infinite collection of them. Okay, so that's a little generalization of the finite mixture setup where I have an infinite random measure. All right, and this measure has some nice properties. It is known as a Dirichlet process, because if you take any finite partition of this x-axis, I have now this picket fence kind of thing. There's an infinite collection. If I take any finite partition, the amount of mass falling in that partition has a finite dimensional Dirichlet distribution. That's why it's called a Dirichlet process. Okay, so it's written this way. It's an argument which is the parameter in terms of the stick-breaking procedure, as well as the parameter in terms of location of the atoms. Those are the two parameters of the Dirichlet process. All right, and now I can update my diagram to be non-parametric. And everything is the same as before. All that's changed is that G, instead of coming from a finite sum up to capital K, is now coming from a Dirichlet process. Right? I have an infinite collection of atoms. But now that I've gotten G, I can do the same thing as before. I can select one of the G's with probability given by pi I, and then get a data point from that particular distribution. Okay, so there's your first, maybe not first, but possibly first introduction to a full-fledged non-parametric Bayesian model that is a clustering model where you don't know the number of clusters a priori. Okay, so you might ask, how does this relate to the Chinese restaurant process, which also is a non-parametric Bayesian clustering model where you don't know the number of clusters a priori? And the answer is they're very closely tied. So if I take this model on the left and I marginalize out G, I integrate it out of the problem. It's just a random quantity. I can integrate it out. Right? When I do, I will get a distribution on just the thetas alone, or the alphas and G's are parameters. So I can ask, what distribution does this induce on the thetas? Right? Well, there's several thetas. There's a box structure. So there's theta 1, theta 2, and so on. So I need what joint distribution do I get on the thetas? Right? And it turns out to be exactly the distribution of the Chinese restaurant process. Okay, so the distribution of the first theta is just G naught. The distribution of the second theta, given the first one, is maybe the same as the previous one, or maybe a brand new draw from G naught, and so on. So this stick breaking process happens to have this magical combinatorial property. It decays, not monotonically, but it kind of tends to go down pretty quickly. The first few sizes are the one they tend to recur a lot. It's like the table. It's preferential attachment. You'll get preferential attachment with a stick breaking procedure, basically. Okay, so there's a piece of mathematics behind that, which you can probably prove yourself. That is interesting and worth doing. Okay, so summary thus far. I've introduced a little bit of kind of the machinery that as non-parametric that we work with all the time. Chinese restaurant process, exchangeability, D-Finetti tells us the underlying random measure, and we've now actually figured out what the random measure was. So this happened in the early 70s. This is not my work, by the way. Somebody named Ferguson at Berkeley discovered the random measure underlying the Chinese restaurant process is this thing called the Dirichlet process. Okay. Just as one example of an application, we applied just the Dirichlet process, nothing more, to this haplotype modeling problem, and we get a state-of-the-art haplotype modeling model. And this might help make this a little more concrete, which is that, remember that for every individual we have a genotype, we unordered a set of markers, and we want to find out what the underlying haplotypes are of the chromosomes. And so the Chinese restaurant position, each table is just the chromosome of an ancestral human. And to sit at a table says, you're saying that's who my ancestor is. Okay, and so we're trying to figure out who are the ancestors, what are the tables, the occupied tables, and who sits at what table, who has who as ancestors. And you update all that with Gibbs sampling. Right, so it's extremely simple. You could implement this in MATLAB, and we did, like in a page of MATLAB. Right? Extremely simple to do, and this works. This is a state-of-the-art method. The current best champion state-of-the-art method is something called phase. This is errors in different regions of the chromosome. And this is just Dirichlet processes. We do a little worse in one region and better in all the other regions, which is an achievement. Phase has been beat out every other method that's been proposed. Okay. Let me just pause and see if there are any quick questions of a kind of clarificatory nature and make sure that everyone's gotten enough of what I've said so far. You get all the details, but yes.
I'm just curious, how could you solve a specific problem with such a general methodology? You didn't put anything into the problem.
Yeah, so I did put a fair amount in from the problem. I mean, I haven't given you any of the solutions to the problems I've talked about before. But, there's G naught, which is a prior on the parameters. And you put a lot of your knowledge into G naught, right? And we're starting to kind of build up, that was just clustering. We haven't done much yet. We're starting to build up towards more of a rich vocabulary of modeling. So you'll start to see where we put in more of our knowledge. But in some sense, the whole point of Bayesian analysis is that we work very hard with the domain expert, and we use our own thinking, and we assess our own priors. We put a lot of knowledge into it. It's kind of a language that allows you to express that knowledge. What I'm trying to do in this talk is show you how you can extend that language to make it fairly rich. So what you're sort of saying is
why would this have commonality? Why would all these problems have the same commonality?
Well, because that's what statistics is. It's the commonality is the problem of inductive difference. You give me a partial picture of some underlying process, and I want to fill that in. Okay? And to do that, I have to make some assumptions. And I want to make some very weak assumptions, the weakest possible. And I want the data to then go together with that to guide me towards good filling in. So I don't want a method that's so specialized it only works on one problem. It really needs to be a general methodology. That's what the whole point of statistics is.
If you're working on one problem, shouldn't you make it be tailored to that problem?
Well, the G naught is tailored to that problem. There's got to be some part of it which is tailored to the problem, right? But there's got to be some part of it which is general. That's kind of, that's why we're smart as humans, that we can go into a new domain, we bring our human knowledge, we bring our ability to see behind data and infer something into the problem. So that the deep problem is that, the inferential issue, about what is it that we do when we're doing this. Okay, so I think I probably ought to let you ponder that, and we can talk about that later, but that's sort of a philosophical issue. Go to this one. So let's start to develop this vocabulary a little bit more broadly. So let's go towards this problem now. We have not just one group of data, we have multiple groups of data. Here's an example. This comes out in the parametric world. It's called the multiple Gaussian means problem. So suppose that I've got San Francisco, New York, Atlanta. And so I've got people in each of these cities, and these are the heights of the people in each of the cities. So I have an underlying height which I'd like to estimate. I'd like to know the underlying height of everybody in New York and everybody in San Francisco and so on. So I could treat these as separate estimation problems, and I could do, say, calculate the maximum likelihood estimate of theta given the heights in people in New York, and similarly for San Francisco. But this is a bad idea for a number of reasons, both theoretical and practical. Particularly, suppose I've got thousands of people in New York that I measure their height at. I got 5 people in San Francisco. So I'll get a very good estimate of theta 1 and a very noisy estimate of theta 2. Right? Well, all of these people are humans, and they sort of share something. And so the theta 1 and theta 2 should somehow be related. And the noisy estimate I get of theta 2 should be ameliorated by the fact I've got a very good estimate of theta 1. So I should share some information on these things. I shouldn't do this. I should shrink in statistical language these estimates towards each other, not treat them separately. And in a hierarchical Bayesian approach, that's really easy to account. You build a richer model, which says that all these thetas, the heights of the people in different cities, are instances of underlying height data of all humans, and they're random draws off of that. So now I have a graph in which this parameter estimate is tied to this parameter estimate by inference of this general graph. Okay, so I'm going to use this plate notation again so that in the next part of the talk I don't have to write a lot of equations. That diagram is the same as this thing. It's really a tree up here. It's kind of a nested plate diagram. The outermost box becomes this replication. The innermost box becomes this replication down here. So this is just a way of writing a tree. All right, so now let's go to this problem of having multiple clusterings. So the haplotype problem, I've got the Asians and the Africans and the Europeans. In each group, I don't know what the genetic underlying haplotypes of the population are. So I can treat them separately, get the haplotypes from the Asians, get them from the Europeans and Africans. But I don't really want to do that. Somehow I want to take into account these are all humans. They have some of the same haplotypes as well, some different ones as well. So this is not a problem which I'm aware of having been faced in many literatures. There's huge literatures on clustering, and I know of sort of no work on the multiple clustering problem, which I have multiple related clusterings. And so what I want to convince you in the next 2 slides is that the non-parametric Bayesian approach really solves this problem really neatly. So the first, we were aware of this problem, we're trying to solve it, and we said, let's just do what we do in the parametric world with our Dirichlet process tool. So instead of having, so we've added this outermost box to this slide I had on the file a while ago, the Dirichlet process next year. So instead of having one G for the whole population, I have GI now. I've got multiple G's, one for each, the Asians, the Africans, the Europeans. Okay? So that's all that we've done. We've made that small change. And now, this architecture fails to solve the problem, not just a little bit, but it completely fails to solve the problem. Okay, you get no sharing under this model between the different groups. All right, and the reason is easy to see. The atoms for G1 are a draw from the stick breaking process, where the location of the atoms come from some underlying G0. Okay, and now G2 is a draw from that same G0. But G0 is a continuous measure. So the atoms for G1 and the atoms for G2 are non-overlapping with probability 1. And if they're not overlapping, there's no sharing. All right, so that fails completely. And I live in a frequentist department where Bayesian methods are sort of often viewed with a little bit of skepticism. And when I mentioned this issue to some of my colleagues, they said, of course, Bayesian methods they're not going to really work in the non-parametric setting. There's theorems that tell you that. And so we kind of puzzled about this and thought, well, there's got to be a way to do this. And the answer is, there is. And the answer is to be more Bayesian, not less Bayesian. So this next slide is one of the main slides of the talk. This is the definition of something called a hierarchical Dirichlet process. All right, so our problem was that
the underlying measure, G naught, which is the source of atoms for different groups, is continuous. All right, so every time you draw from it, you get a brand new location, which has nothing to do with the previous ones. Well, if G naught were not continuous, if it were discrete, then every time I sample from it, I get some of the same atoms again. So that would be kind of solving the problem in a very, that would be cheating. Okay, you would let G naught be, you'd know the answer in advance, right? But it would solve the problem. Okay? So you realize that you're halfway there, because the answer is that if you know what's solve the problem, you assume that it exists, but you don't know it. You're ignorant about G naught. So you assume that it's discrete, but you don't know what it is. Now you're not cheating. Yeah. No, we're not going to do that. No, New Yorkers are New Yorkers, San Francisco people are San Francisco people. But the underlying height of somebody in New York can be the same as the underlying height of someone in San Francisco. Okay, their parameter can be the same. They're not moved from one slot to the other, but their parameter can be the same. I hope that will become clearer here in a minute. Okay, so this can solve the problem. If we make G naught discrete but unknown, then we're not cheating, and we solve our technical problem. We have a way now to share things among different groups. All right, so now we have to think as Bayesians, how do we get a measure to be discrete and random? All right. Well, we know how to do that. The Dirichlet process. That solves the process. All we have to do is build another Dirichlet process up above. Okay, so the answer is that you make G naught itself, which was a parameter before, itself be a draw from a Dirichlet process with an underlying stick-breaking parameter and an underlying mother of all atoms, I like to call it, which gives you atoms for G naught. And then having gotten G naught, you draw each of the G's for each of the separate populations from, again, a Dirichlet process, which G naught is its parameter now, which is going in as discrete, so they get to share things, but random, so that we're not building in a solution from the beginning. All right, so there's the diagram. And if you get this diagram, you've gotten major part of the talk, which is the Hartley-Dirichlet process. So this is the same thing as on the previous slide, just written out in mathematics, and it's a diagram. So again, you generate G naught from some underlying mother of all atoms H, and that gives you, say in the genetics example, all of the underlying haplotypes for all humans. And then each group, the Asians, the Africans, and the Europeans, you draw from those haplotypes, and you get different frequencies for them in the different groups. And then everything else goes as before. It's just a mixture model once you've got the measures for each of the different groups. So we have sharing atoms among multiple groups. And you can now ask, what happens if you integrate out all this underlying D-Finity type randomness, the G's and G naughts? Well, you can integrate them out, and what you'll get is a distribution on all the theta ij's. Now, there's theta for each group and for each individual within a group. And you can ask what that stochastic process is you get on the thetas, and we gave it a name. We called it the Chinese restaurant franchise. So we now have not just one restaurant, we have multiple restaurants. There's the Asian restaurant, the Europeans, the Africans. And again, everyone comes into a restaurant as before and sits at a table, a portion number of people to the table. But they also, when they sit at a table, they go to a buffet line and they get a dish from the buffet line. Right? And they bring it to the table, and everybody else sitting at the table inherits that same dish. Okay? And now, up in the buffet line, when you choose a dish, you put a little X next to it that says someone selected that dish. And then when I go to the buffet line, I choose a dish proportional number of people in all restaurants who've chosen that dish. That's what gets sharing among all the different restaurants. All right, so this is not just a cute little metaphor that we dreamed up for this problem. This is the marginal distribution under a hierarchical Dirichlet process. So mathematically, that is the marginal distribution. Okay, so if you follow the talk now, you'll sort of realize we've got a nice solution to our multiple groups problem. We can now do Bayesian inference on this Chinese restaurant franchise, and we've done that. And so here's an example of doing this back on this haplotype problem. We now actually have Yorubans and Europeans. In this particular case, we did this with two groups. And this is an error measure again. This is different regions of chromosome. And these are different methods that are errors. The new method is the red method. It is the state-of-the-art method for grouped haplotype inference. And we also did this for the protein folding problem. So again, we have these Ramachandran plots, and now we have alanine, and we've given a context. The left context I have none, so this is just a right context model, and the right we have serine, which is another amino acid. So this is
we have now 20 different plots for alanine, where we have 20 different neighbors on the right-hand side. So this is just the conditional of alanines given serine, and these contour diagrams is the output of our model. It gives you a probability distribution on the space of dihedral angles for alanine in the context of serine. And there'll be a different plot for alanine in the context of, say, tryptophan. And these plots will be somewhat similar. They will share some of the same atoms. So maybe there's kind of an alpha helix structure here, which is shared in the two cases, but there's some other little piece which is different because of the chemistry of the right neighbor changing the configuration of alanine. On the next plot, I have a little example of just the improvement that this has given us over what's been the state of the art. So I find a mixture model. And so no improvement will be here in this law of probability. And this is for all the different 20 amino acids, and we're getting huge improvements for two different kinds of models. And so this is now being used in Rosetta, which is the world's best protein folding program, and it has given significant boost to protein folding results. So in the next class competition, this is going to be used as part of the Rosetta procedure. Rosetta is the current champion protein folding program. As I mentioned earlier, this has been an open problem, how to deal with hidden Markov models when you don't know the number of states. You might naively think this is solved by the Dirichlet process. Kind of, you don't know how many clusters, you don't know the number of states. That should be the same kind of problem. But it's not, because if I'm in a certain current state and I don't know how many next states there are, I can use the Dirichlet process to generate next states. But now I need to tie those between different current states. Like, so if I'm in current state number 1 and I jump to some open-ended number of next states, and I'm in current state number 2 and I generate to a non-overlapping set of next states, then I'm not going to get a hidden Markov model chain. I'm going to get kind of a tree structure. Right? So to get a chain where I keep using the same states over and over again and get dynamic programming to work for me, I need to use the hierarchical Dirichlet process, which will tie together the state transition matrices. So the underlying hidden Markov model is a state transition matrix. It's a matrix, and each row is a mixture model. It's a distribution over next states. And I need to tie those rows together so they have the same range. So the hierarchical Dirichlet process, in short, solves this. And one of the people in the audience is Emily Fox, who's down here from MIT. I guess she drove all the way down here, and she's been working with this recently, and has a very nice solution to what's called the speaker diarization problem, where I have a microphone and I have a whole bunch of people talking, and I don't know how many people are in the room, and I want to say in this slot of time, person A is talking, and in this slot of time, person B, and so on. And so here, the number of states has to do with the number of people, which is unknown, and I need to figure that out as part of the inference problem, and this methodology basically solves that problem. We've also used this for hidden Markov trees, by the way. That's a chain structure, the classical agent of the chain. You can also build trees of hidden Markov models. And we've used this for image denoising and scene recognition problems, and it yields also quite good performance, just with the same kind of idea. Okay, so how much time do I have left? I think I'm moving towards the end. 5 minutes? Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so that was kind of Dirichlet processes, and I hope you found that interesting. It gets a little more technical than I've described, but not hugely so. At the end of the day, these procedures go into a few lines of MATLAB. It's really fairly a simple methodology. Okay, but that's not all you want. That's not the vocabulary I want to present to you. Certainly as computer scientists, you want to be able to build richer kinds of stochastic processes and richer kind of objects. So I hope you got the idea. This is a methodology. This isn't kind of an answer. This is a toolbox. So here's another item in the toolbox, something called the beta process. So the Dirichlet process, what's kind of nice about it is it's a clustering methodology, which is helpful in many problems. What's not nice about it is that it's a clustering methodology. Everybody gets assigned to one cluster and not any other clusters. Right? And that's kind of limiting. So in many situations, it might be nice to have attributes. So for example, I like jazz music, I speak Italian, I live in Berkeley. Okay? Maybe you like jazz music, but you don't live in Berkeley. Maybe you speak Italian, et cetera, et cetera. So we might share some attributes in common. And that you can think of that as putting us in clusters where we have kind of two to the power set of these attributes. But that's kind of a dumb way to think about it. A better way to think about it, what are those attributes? Not what are the clusters? Okay, so that's an inferential problem. What are the unknown attributes underlying a collection of objects? Well, so the Dirichlet process doesn't solve that problem. It's the wrong tool for that problem. Right? So you might ask, are there other tools which would be right for that problem? And there is. There's something called the beta process. So this is a different stochastic process. It's an example of a much richer toolbox, something called Levy processes, which are just stochastic process increments. And the beta process is one that assigns a beta random variable, basically, to small regions of a space. I think a picture is probably the best way to describe this. So a draw from a beta process is this little blue thing right here, those little spiky things. I did this on the interval from 0 to 1. So that's a random measure, just like for the Dirichlet process, except for the Dirichlet process, those heights would all add up to 1. For the beta process, those heights do not add up to 1. They add up to some number bigger than 1, okay? Which is key here, all right? And given a draw from a beta process, each one of those, kind of in any little region here, like here, I get the height of the total height inside of that region as described by a beta random variable. That's the idea. Anyway, given those heights, however I got them, I can now repeatedly toss coins with these heights as the probabilities of the coin toss. And I will get a sparse binary matrix. I'll get mainly zeros, but I'll occasionally get some ones. Right? And because I'm drawing from the same underlying random draw, I will tend to get ones occurring in the same columns. Okay? So I've got now a distribution on sparse binary random matrices. The Dirichlet process would have 1, 1, and all zeros in every row. And I'll get multiple ones in a row. That's the change. Right? But this object, as a mathematical object, has, again, exchangeability properties, and all my inferential machinery applies to it. I can build hierarchies of them, tie them, and do all kinds of things that I did with the Dirichlet process. I can now do that with beta processes. It has 2 parameters. There's gamma and C, and you get kind of different classes of random matrices depending on the choices of these 2 parameters. You can now ask about what's the marginal distribution of the beta process. So the beta process was that kind of little collection of sticks there, but at the end of the day, I got a binary random matrix. Can I just give you a distribution directly in binary random matrices without the underlying beta process, like I did in the Chinese restaurant? I gave you a distribution on tables without the stick breaking. And the answer is yes. So this is called the Indian buffet process. And this was first described by Griffiths and Armani, who didn't know about the beta process. And they came up with this kind of just thinking about binary random matrices for having certain mathematical properties. Then we realized that the underlying Dirichlet, or the underlying De Fidetti distribution was the beta process. So we have now an Indian buffet in which there are an infinite number of dishes. The first person comes in and chooses a Poisson number of dishes. And they put a little X next to them saying that I've chosen those dishes. The next person comes in and resamples some number of the previous dishes that the first person sampled, and then samples another number of Poisson new dishes. And this keeps going, and you fill a matrix in this way. Okay, so that's called the Indian buffet process. And Indian has mathematical properties to make this suitable for all kinds of modeling and sampling problems. And it turns out that that has the beta distribution. The beta process is its underlying distribution. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time now. Let me just sort of say that everything else I've done in the talk with the Dirichlet process, you can now do with the beta process. So you can build hierarchies of these things where the base, you have multiple beta processes now, and the base measure for one beta process is sampled from underlying beta process. So now why would you want to do that? Well, there's all kinds of interesting applications in vision and document processing and so on. I think I'm going to not try to explain this diagram, really just say this in English. So one application of this we've done is we have now multiple groups of documents, where a document is a sparse matrix of which words are in the document. So it's very sparse, right? Any given document has only a small number of words, of possible words. Okay? And I don't know a priori which of the words being used in some collection of documents, so I'm modeling that. And now I've got multiple collections of documents, and I like to share the estimates among the different collections. So this is one of the key problems in document processing, which is that you have sparsity. So it's very likely, any given word in the vocabulary I've never seen before when I see a random document. And if I just take the maximum likelihood estimates from previous documents, I'll assign 0 probability to every new document. It's kind of a classical problem. So the way this is kind of handled is ad hoc. You shrink. You say every word has a little epsilon probability of occurring. And then the big problem is, what is epsilon? So if I have huge numbers of vocabulary items, epsilon needs to be really small, and it's hard to fix epsilon. Right, so this has been a problem. It is an ongoing problem, like in spam detection and so on. It's one of the problems with naive Bayesian methodology, which is you don't know how to set these kind of epsilon parameters. Okay? And well, the real answer is that you don't want to have an epsilon parameter at all. So I want to have multiple groups of documents, and I want to shrink them towards each other, not towards some externally defined epsilon. Right? And so if you did follow what I talked about, the beta process, it does exactly that. You can have multiple beta processes and they will shrink towards each other as the probabilities of the words occurring in the document.
So this fixes one of the problems. Naive Bayes is a parametric methodology, and it had that problem just because of that. If you go to the non-parametric setting, you fix the problem. And I'm now actually out of time. Let me not describe the dependent diners process. Let me just say that we're working with all kinds of other stochastic processes. This happens to be one that is non-exchangeable. So it's our first foray into non-exchangeable methods. And I'll get into that if there's any experts that care to learn about that. Okay, so I'm done. The underlying mathematical principle in this talk has been exchangeability and all the virtues of it for building blocks that you can use to construct interesting data structures. But I guess there's kind of a philosophical underpinning of the talk as well. This is for a computer science audience, and I think most of what I've talked about is not familiar to you. But this is the vocabulary that I use, that we use in my field, of stochastic processes, of probabilities, of inference, of, these are the ideas. And especially for the students in the audience, this is the vocabulary you will have to use if you stay in the field of computer science, I believe, and certainly if you're in any interest in machine learning. This is the language in which you express uncertainty, in which you manipulate that uncertainty and you try to make good decisions under that uncertainty. So I think it's a fantastically exciting time to be a computer scientist who also learns about probability and statistics and thinks about the way that computation and inference merge. That's kind of one of the main topics of our era, is not just doing a bunch of equations, statistical convergence in the limit, but really thinking algorithmically how that happens, and not just writing out an algorithm hoping it'll work in real life and not be brittle, but thinking about the uncertainty involved in your algorithm when it meets the real world. So we need to be both a statistician and a computer scientist. Thank you.
Time for a few questions.
Yes.
I know you didn't talk about inference, but can you say something about the complexity of inference in these problems or tractability?
Yeah, so the real answer is I can't say very much about it for most of these problems. So every step of these algorithms is polynomial time with sort of linear time, typically. So every step is really quite, basically it goes linear with the number of data points. All right, so that's good. And it's just that the steps of the number of steps of the algorithms is not controlled. So these are all the algorithms that I've taught, well, no, that's not true. Most of the ones that people work with in literature and that we worked with here are Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms that have a mixing time, which is some unknown eigenvalue. So we find empirically, whether we're mixing it fast and so on and so forth, but we don't know a priori. On the other hand, some of our algorithms are variational algorithms where we developed a deterministic optimization procedure for finding the posterior distribution. And there you can sort of use some notions from convex optimization, sort of say something about how long it'll take. But as I said something about the exciting problems of our era, this is one of the big ones. Is that when I say computation, actually what I really typically mean is optimization theory. And so how to use the serious tools of optimization theory to say something about how computational complexity of a statistical inference procedure. That's sort of still many open problems there, in particular for all these kind of models. These are very rich models that don't converge. They do converge, but we don't know how fast. Yes?
As you see in your talk, the underlying principle is that of exchangeability.
Yes.
How general is this? Because in low dynamic forms, it matters your things now.
Yeah, so
if you're tackling probably static problems,
right.
What class of problems do you have?
Yeah, so indeed, on the next to last slide, I talked about the same notions of partial exchangeability, and there's other ways to back away from exchangeability. So exchangeability is not the right tool for all problems. It's the kind of, so typically we have these kind of tree representations is one way to think about it. Within every branch of a tree, I want every entity to be exchangeable, but the tree is not exchangeable. So that's called partial exchangeability. And time series are other examples where you don't want exchangeability. So I've got this covariate, which is time, which kind of desymmetrizes the problem. Right, whatever you start moving towards away from exchangeability, you have computational issues to face because you can't use the combinatorics that we are able to use here. But you have to face them, and you start to face them. And so the language of partial exchangeability is one way to head in that direction.
Do you work right now more on the other type of problems, the non-exchangeable problems?
Sort of both. They're both critical, but non-exchangeable is just much, much harder, and you can make enormous progress with exchangeable models. So one example is these in document processing, what Google and everyone else does, is they take a document, they throw away the order of the words. It's called the bag of words model. And everyone poo-poos it, it's such a stupid thing. But it's actually not so stupid after all, because it's not assuming the words are independent. Okay, that's a key confusion. If I see the first word in a document and it's an Italian word, I'm going to guess the next word is an Italian word. All right? Those words are not independent. And the underlying principle is exchangeability, because what happens is that I see the first word, I learn something about the underlying G. And then given the underlying G, I can predict the next word. All right? That's exchangeable. Independent would say there's no underlying G at all. They're just independent. So backwards actually means exchangeable, not independent. And so exchangeable is a deep concept. You think it means independence, right? But it's definitely not. It's much, much richer idea than that. There's this underlying G you're trying to infer. Once you learn about G, you can say things about that. But G can be very rich. Okay, so right. So that said, there are situations where you have a priori desymmetrizations of the random variables, and you want to condition on those and take those into account. And issues come up there. Let me just say that would be a whole other talk. Michael.
So, I was wondering if you could link up the stuff that you talked about to classification, which I think for a lot of intro machine learning classes, a lot of the time is spent on that. I assume that there's some fairly deep connections there, but I was wondering if you could.
Yeah, so maybe one way to answer your question is that there is another class of stochastic processes called the Gaussian process. Right? I talked about the Dirichlet process and the Bethe process. Well, there's some other, the Gaussian process. Right? Well, the Gaussian process has a parameter, which is the covariance function of a Gaussian process. It's not a matrix anymore because it's infinite dimensional, but it has a covariance function, which is the covariance between any 2 points in some real valued domain. Right? That's the parameter of a Gaussian process. That thing is also called a kernel. And so if you know what a kernel machine is, the kernel in kernel machines is just exactly the covariance function in a Gaussian process. So most kernel machines, including the support vector machine and all, have an interpretation in terms of underlying Gaussian process, not a Dirichlet process or whatever. Okay, so that's much beyond classification. That's many other kind of methodologies of machine learning can be viewed from a non-parametric Bayesian point of view using the Gaussian process. And so that would be another talk. I also work on Gaussian processes, but that's kind of a more classical topic. This was a more exotic, data structures, discrete trees. Kind of how do we do probabilities on those, and not on continuous functions like discriminant functions and classification. But I'm glad you asked the question to give me an opportunity to say something about that. Yes.
So more of a philosophical question, maybe.
Yeah.
I'll answer it now or later. But somehow when you take a Bayesian approach like this, you're sort of pushing what you don't know to a different level. Namely, in this case, do I assume there's a Dirichlet? Well, we're again that way. So I'd like to know how you address that potential criticism. I mean, one answer would be, well, it works. I mean, we tried in these problems, and we do better than other methods. Is there more than that answer?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, as a statistician, I feel obliged not only to present a method, but to say something theoretical about it, that it works. And when I say works, that's when I put on my frequentist hat. And I say things about it's consistent. So under some broad class of distributions, I will get eventually the right answer. Or it's efficient, or that, i.e. that it'll converge relatively quickly to the right answer. And there is a checkered history on non-parametric Bayes. There's some cases known where it's not consistent. And there's some other cases, there's some nice now general sufficient conditions where it is consistent, and so on. So no matter what you assume about the underlying parameters, you can actually still get guarantees that you will converge to the right answer, and you will get rate guarantees in some cases. So that's a whole important issue as its own. And also, as part of your question, is kind of the checking and diagnostics question. That's all a priori statements about some methodology that I guarantee you it will work. Right? But after I've got some data and I've made an inference, did I do a good job? Right? And there's a whole, whenever I write a paper in the statistics literature, I don't just say, here's a method, here's a data set, and it worked. But I also say, well, I changed my hyperparameters a little bit, and it still worked. Or I took about this data point, and it changed it this much. I put in a different assumption about my hyperparameter, and now I show there was either no sensitivity or a lot of sensitivity to that assumption. Right? So that's always also part of inference, which is not just to say, I got the right answer, guys, but is to check what you've done a posteriori. So I'm giving you a philosophical answer, but it's really very practical. Whenever you're doing inference, there's some chance you're wrong. And so if you're a frequentist, you try to prove that away a priori. That, I'm going to give you the right answer if I get large enough data points. But any statistician also has to kind of do some posterior checking and sort of say, it looks like I did pretty well. There's no magic there. You can't just sort of, I got the best method in the world, that's it. Go home. Yes?
In terms of the initial input parameters, such as the alpha 0 or
Yes.
gamma and Poisson parameters,
Yes.
how do you go about choosing?
Okay, glad you asked. That's really kind of the same question. How do you choose these hyperparameters? In the Bayesian analysis, you push this thing up into higher and higher hyperparameters, and you allow lots of randomness lower down in the hierarchy. So actually, in all this stuff, we put priors on the alpha. We don't actually stop at alpha. We go up another level beyond that. And similarly, G naught, that's not even a parameter. We have a whole distribution on that too. And then finally, we stop that process at some point. And then we do this kind of posterior checking. We sort of say, well, the underlying hyperparameter, if I made it 2 or 3 or 10, I get the same answer. So I'm happy. That's what the whole point of Bayesian analysis is that I'm eventually going to get up to a point where it doesn't seem to matter what the underlying a priori assumptions I brought into the problem were. That I still get the same answer. The whole point of being non-parametric is that I'm not kind of rigidly sticking with one model no matter what. I'm allowing the model to grow and follow the data. All right. So, in fact, you can look at our papers and sort of how we did this. There's always an art to sort of shooting these things, but we tried to follow kind of reasonable ways to choose these things, and we put distributions on them to reflect that we don't know a priori that alpha naught should be a 5 or a 2 or a 1. We put a distribution on that and let the data try to tell us something about what alpha naught should be. But of course, that distribution has its own hyperparameter, and so we're pushing this thing higher and higher, but we're not that uncomfortable with that. Tom.
What's the chance that you are checking your sensitivity?
I can't hear you.
You are checking the sensitivity of the match of the hyperparameter.
Yeah, there's a hyperparameter, and we set it to 0.1, to 5, to 10, to 100. And then we do our whole analysis over again, and we see how much did my actual inference change. And if it doesn't change too much, then we kind of think we're done. We can write the paper. If it's changed a lot, we're not done. Then we've either got to, if this is a real biologic problem, then I will sit down with my domain expert and say, what do you really think about this? And try to get ways to get them to put their expert knowledge into it. Because I got to give them an answer, and I want it to be the best answer I can give him. So I got to do something.
Are there other methods where you do check those? Or is it basically the way you check that?
Yeah, there's Bayesian diagnostics. If you'll pick up a good book on Bayesian analysis, you'll see a whole chapter on Bayesian diagnostics, which is exactly about this problem of a posterior checking. It kind of uses frequentist ideas to do that. It's kind of the strengths of these, merging these two paradigms. Yes.
You have also a Turkish strong process, but you can't compute. But you see, all right, it's convenient to compute the Chinese restaurant process.
Yes.
But I checked hyperparameters, it's all fine, but actually it's possible it's not
Not a good
process,
model.
not the Chinese
Right.
Restaurant, it's the Turkish restaurant model.
Right.
But you can't compute that. How
Right.
do you do that?
Great question. First of all, by our diagnostics, we should learn it's not the Chinese restaurant. All right. If it's really not, our diagnostics should tell us that. Okay. It doesn't say it's the Turkish restaurant process. It just says it's not the Chinese restaurant. That's called the goodness of fit problem. And we have methods that statisticians have methods for that. Right. Now you're saying, well, maybe I know what this. I've described the Turkish restaurant process that maybe is not exchangeable. It's not computationally tractable, but it's really beautiful, and I like to use it. Well, then we put on our optimization theorist hat, which is saying we have an intractable model, but we can relax it in various ways. If you can do a semi-definite programming relaxation of that model, right, and hopefully then get a good approximation to the original inference, not the right result, but just like a theoretical computer scientist will do. They'll take an NP-hard problem, and they will get maybe a semi-definite relaxation of it, like graph cuts, and then hopefully prove that you get within some factor the right answer. And we can and do that in our kind of problems as well. At the end of the day, posterior inference is an optimization problem. And if it's intractable, I can relax it. And maybe it's even intractable under my relaxation. I'd like to maybe prove that too. That's again one of these. There's many open problems to solve there, but that's the methodology you follow. So you don't give up on your beautiful intractable model. You still work with it, but you view it as an unattainable goal, and you pull away from it. You relax.
So our speaker will be around for a few minutes after.